Ocarina of Time, The Legend of Zelda, Nintendo 64, 1998. This came out, a global release actually, which is kind of neat. November 21st, 1998. I remember where I was. I did not own a Nintendo 64 at the time.
Wow, that's
so
crazy.
This sold me on it for sure. Shigeru Miyamoto is his last directed Zelda. Of course, the creator of the Legend of Zelda series and Super Mario Brothers. Of course, he worked on this with some other famous people, including Aonuma, who now makes all of the Zelda games. So this is kind of a dream team. This game is about two worlds. It's about the past and the future, and a little ocarina that links them together.
Yeah.
Hence the name.
Yeah, it basically, it duplicates the kind of two-world setup from Link to the Past, where
Which
you
is
had
a
the dark and the
criticism.
light world, but they did it so differently in this game. But it's not just that, right? It's like somebody took a Link to the Past, like this perfectly rendered 2D world with like the item lock gates, where like you progress by getting new items, and then did it in a three-dimensional world that changing. It starts to rain at parts in the game. You've got day and night cycles. Like you go underwater. It just has everything.
Yeah,
My fond memory for that game, by the way, I played it. I got stuck, and a gentleman helped me out get past it named Shigeru Miyamoto. He was standing behind me. They had an event at here, Julius Castle, and like he was super nervous about all these journalists playing this game for the first time.
What section did you play?
It was, I got stuck when you're going to Hyrule Castle and you have to meet Malon and then climb a vine. And like she only,
that part's a little bit
she only
obscure.
showed up at a certain, like you had to do something, or you only showed up during the daytime. And the day-night cycle doesn't pass when you're in town, so you had to go
Right.
out
So you
to a
have to
certain
leave the
area.
town and
Yeah,
come back,
yeah. So he pointed that out.
Oh, that's
It was
amazing.
nice of him.
There are two Links in this game, as well as two worlds. You got Big Link and Little Link. You got Old Link and Young Link, which I really like.
Yep.
It's kind of unexpected when it happens. There's also two Zeldas. A really neat younger Zelda that's a princess, and then a Zelda who becomes a warrior.
Well, there are three Zeldas, really.
Who's the third Zelda?
Chic.
Spoilers.
Well, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but there's also
I guess
Zelda
they
as a
reveal
grown-up
her
woman.
as
yeah,
a grown-up who has the
Yeah,
magic
for sure.
shield power.
I think, that game felt so big when it came out. And I didn't have, maybe I did have the internet at the time yet, but I hadn't quite figured out to like use the internet to look up game help. Right. And so like, I just remember the Fire Temple, I would go in and try to figure out where I was going and get stuck. And then I would, like the way that I would play games back then was a little schizophrenic. So I would just bounce. I'd get stuck and then just run around the world and just hit stuff with hit stuff with sticks and go back to being young and go back to being old. And that made that game last for like months for me. Like, and then I'd slowly, okay, let me try to take another crack at this temple and then get in. And then that moment where you'd find a key that like you'd just been completely stuck on for weeks, like just felt so good. And like slowly working that way through my game without just, like I would never have the patience for that now. I would just look it up on IGN wikis and guides.
It had those moments where you're exploring the world and you see something that's clearly locked, right? And like now you understand the kind of like the signs of a 3D Zelda game. It's like, oh, that target means hookshot target, right? Like it's so obvious now, but a lot of those things appeared for the first time in 3D. What I really liked was like you would walk into Kakariko Town, right? And like you see the well and you're like, oh man, there's something about the well. So you're spending like an hour trying to figure out how to get in. There's nothing, you can't get in. And then
to come back later.
Later in the story, you come back and it's this awesome, creepy cutscene
And
of
it's
this like
been under
black
there the whole
swirling
time.
mass. Yeah. That's so good.
So my fondest memory of this game is I stopped playing video games. I had a period of my life in which I got over video games.
Sounds very fun.
I know it was sad, and like I didn't have a Nintendo 64. I got burned because of the 32X Sega CD Saturn situation. I was like, this is ridiculous. I'm not doing this. And the PlayStation came out, and I'm like, no more. And I stopped playing for just a little bit. And this is what got me back into it. It's because Thanksgiving this year, my friend had come back from college, and he showed me this game. I was over at his house with my girlfriend. We were just sitting there watching it, and he said, watch this. And he pointed, point anywhere that you can see in the background of this game, and you can go there.
Yeah.
And so he was at Lake Hylia, which is what I call it. I know it's Hylia.
You mean Hylia, yeah.
And and he said, I was like, well, how about that mountain with a ring around it?
Yeah.
And he did. And of course, that's about as far as you can run, but it was a very long period of time, running all across the field, through the village, up the mountain. And then you get to the mountain and you have to climb the sheer wall, and then you go inside the volcano top. It was like, there's nothing like that in video games at the time.
Yeah,
Just remarkable fantasy open world.
That overworld feels small by today's standards. You go over one little hill, and then the castle's right there. But it didn't feel that way back then.
You see things in the distance that are actually not 3D models. It's like tapestry.
Disneyland. It has like a fake hill background.
Nowadays you get games like Skyrim where they render the world and you can see the distance and you can go there, but they actually carefully created this world and like had to just struggle and fight the system basically to make it work that way, right?
I mean, it was a gigantic game. I mean, it could be speedrun really rapidly, by today's, but it had 9 dungeons, or really 9.5 if you want to count.
I loved when it opened up and you found out there were 6 more dungeons and 6 more areas.
Right, like
the last couple you don't even expect, like the giant Gerudo Desert.
Yeah, if you're just playing the way I did and just bouncing around this world and you don't know where anything is, you don't know what you're doing. It took you a long time to even become Adult Link, and then you're like, wow, the game's just starting.
It just opens up there. I love that feeling. Incredible. It's like the castle flipping in Symphony of the Night.
Yeah.
That you have so much more game to play and you didn't know, and that game just promises so much. I also, we have to mention the soundtrack. I mean, the game is about an ocarina, which is an instrument. It's about playing that instrument, but it's also about a soundtrack that instrument is woven in and out of so brilliantly. I don't think there's a more iconic game soundtrack that's as full, that has so many full orchestrated songs. I mean, there's touring companies that just play Zelda music now.
Yeah, maybe Final Fantasy, but it's certainly up there with.
It's interesting because when Ocarina of Time came out, the game represented a shift from the older Zelda games where you always had an orchestra score playing, right? Like a MIDI score. When you went into the dungeons, actually, they had these atmospheric sound effects, more like some areas in Super Metroid, honestly. And like some of that was the limitation of the platform, right? Like, you had to trade off like processor cycles by having multi-layered music, like multi-voice music. So they did very simple stuff.
Like the forest tempo just had weird
screams.
like,
and so it's very simple, but that restraint makes it so memorable and it sounds so great.
It was a hugely innovative game with things like Z-targeting, really figuring out how to make combat work in a 3D space, things that were copied, yet another sort of Miyamoto just stroke of brilliance that you would see like a lightning strike and then games were different after that.
It's funny because the way they do it nowadays on the Wii U or even on the Wii, I don't think we're as elegant as that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, Z-targeting, just to explain if you hadn't played it, is that you don't move a camera around when you encounter an enemy because you don't have another stick to move your camera around. So what you do is you just lock onto that enemy, and so you're always circling around it. And it makes for action combat that's really nice because you can parry and dodge and attack in a really, really fluid way.
I remember thinking weird things that were controversial at the time that now are like, you just kind of accept. Yeah, the no jump button, exactly.
Yeah.
You couldn't understand how it would work, but it totally works great. Totally.